So thank you very much, Muge, and I want to thank the Center for European Studies for inviting me to give this talk today. The research I'm going to present draws on data that I've collected as part of an in-progress book manuscript, comparing the politics around religion, secularism, and nationhood in France, but also in the Canadian province of Quebec. So I'm going to use today's presentation as an opportunity to flesh out some of the preliminary conclusions of the book in relation to the French case. However, I'd be thrilled to answer any questions in the Q&A about the comparative angle of the book and about the Quebec case in particular. So this is a map indicating which European countries have issued or are considering issuing national or regional level bans of Islamic facial coverings. Just last week, Austria joined France and Belgium in deciding to prohibit such coverings in all public spaces. The Netherlands also introduced a partial ban in 2015, and the German Chancellor Angela Merkel endorsed her party's call to ban full Islamic facial coverings, quote, wherever it is legally possible, unquote, last year. Now, scholars have gone to significant lengths in trying to explain why it is that some immigrant-receiving countries have opted to limit the rights of religious minorities through restrictive laws, whereas other countries have not. And the prevailing story holds that these restrictions derive from states' entrenched discourses or philosophies of integration. So in other words, it's a story about how ideas, as they become entrenched in institutions over time, ultimately dictate the way state actors interpret and face challenges associated with religious diversity. This story is particularly prevalent in the case of France, where two laws are on the books that curtail the wearing of Islamic signs in public spaces and institutions. So in 2004, the right-wing Union pour un mouvement populaire government led by Jacques Chirac responded to controversy around headscarf-wearing high school students by issuing a ban of ostentatious religious signs in all public schools. Then in 2010, following a year-long nationwide debate over Islamic face veils, which is a term that includes the niqab and burqa, estimated to be worn by fewer than 1,200 women across France, the French government under Nicolas Sarkozy implemented a ban of facial coverings in all public spaces. So following in the tradition of those who see discourses of integration as the driving forces for policy in this area, scholars have tied these laws to France's republican tradition, which centers on four principles: liberté or freedom, égalité or equality, fraternité or solidarity, and most especially laïcité, which is the French term for the separation of church and state. According to scholars writing on France, the intersection of these values in French Republican thought has over time rendered an idea of nationhood, which is based in individuals' shared commitment to participation in a common and secular public sphere. As a result, immigrants to France are considered well integrated if and when they shed their cultural and religious particularities to embrace an understanding of liberté, égalité, fraternité, and laïcité that's prescribed by the majority population. This notion that republicanism produces a unique discomfort with religion in the public space, thus logically resulting in restrictive laws, is equally prevalent in French political discourse. So this is a quote or an excerpt from an interview I conducted with the socialist MP Jean Glavany, who was a key player in bringing about the 2010 face veil ban. When I asked about his and other politicians' motivations for introducing this law, he replied very simply, well, we are all Republicans, each and every one of us. With some exceptions on the extreme left and extreme right, we are all Republicans with the same set of values. So you can see that this notion that republicanism undergirds political responses to Islamic veiling in France is deeply entrenched. But I want to problematize that story in today's talk. And specifically, I'm going to suggest that politics, particularly the battles among parties vying for the legitimacy to govern, critically shapes how ideas like republicanism are utilized to produce nationhood in the context of debates over Islamic signs. I'm going to make this case by bringing into conversation two literatures that rarely engage with one another. The first pertains to party politics, more specifically to the ways that parties, through the battles they undertake for electoral success, shape the discursive content of political space. And I'm going to draw on two main resources from that literature. One is the notion that party political conflict is constituted by the positions parties occupy along the main axis of competition. So in most Western electoral systems, that axis maps onto differing views about how to handle the distribution of economic resources, with parties on the left advocating a degree of redistribution by the state, while right-wing parties hold more faith in the distributive powers of the market. But thanks to the growing prevalence of post-material values as themes in political discourse, an alternative axis of political competition is emerging, along which parties take position vis-a-vis social issues like feminism, the environment, or identity. And I'm going to suggest that the dilemmas that arise from parties' efforts to navigate those cross-cutting axes of competition inform their responses to the question of Islamic veiling in ways that sociologists have failed to sufficiently recognize. To make that case, I'm also going to draw on the notion of issue ownership. So this concept has primarily been used by political scientists to illustrate how ultra-right political parties upset the established dynamics of party political contention. So they do so, the argument goes, by enticing their mainstream right-wing political parties into seeking ownership of the issues that they introduce into political discourse, such as the threat of Islam to national identity, for example. What's been neglected by that literature, though, is that the left faces a particular kind of quandary when it comes to meeting the challenges raised by the ultra-right. So in today's presentation, I'm going to pay particular attention to how the Socialist Party in France has responded to dilemmas arising from ultra-right competition in the context of the face veil debate. So my hope is that by bringing party politics to the forefront in analyzing restrictive laws, we can gain new insights into how nationhood is produced in countries that face the challenge of a religiously diverse population. Specifically, by thinking more methodically about how key national tropes map on to political parties' interests, we can better appreciate the ways that nationhood is contested. And I also think that a politics-centered approach sheds light on the role of nationhood as a contingent cultural and discursive formation that takes shape or whose meanings take shape in the situated actions of individuals. So the remainder of the talk will unfold in 5 parts. I'll start by introducing the case in more detail, focusing on party political battles around the 2010 face veil ban. Then I'll briefly describe the data and analytical strategy that I deploy in analyzing such battles and their effects on the production of French nationhood. In the 3rd section, I'll paint a picture of electoral politics in France, emphasizing how the ascent of the ultra-right Front National party has challenged the traditional axis of competition in French politics, with important implications for positioning around the Islamic signs issue. And then using that picture as a backdrop, I'm going to examine how in trying to prevent the Front National from claiming full ownership of the face veil issue, politicians on the mainstream right and left have engaged in a discursive reconstruction of French nationhood. And then I'll conclude with a summary of the main implications for how we think about politics and the production of nationhood in debates over religious signs. So over the last 3 decades, France's Muslim population, which today accounts for nearly 10% of the country's total size, have become key objects of a highly politicized debate over who belongs to the French nation and how. And this population draws its origins primarily from Tunisia and Morocco, which were both protectorates of France until 1956, and Algeria, which was officially a part of metropolitan France until the end of its bloody War of Independence in 1962. Clustered in city suburbs that are marked by widespread poverty and unemployment, these North African communities have become the prime targets of a campaign to curtail Islamic religious signs in France's public spaces and institutions. And this campaign takes place against a backdrop of successive historical debates over the role that religion should play in French society. So the first key debate can be linked to the 1789 revolution, which crystallized 2 competing approaches to organizing the relationship between church and state. On the one hand, you had a conservative approach advocating an institutionalized state religion under the joint control of the Pope and the French monarch. And on the other hand, you had a more truly revolutionary approach that sought to put an end to Catholic Church dominance over public affairs. With the Jules Ferry laws of the 1880s, the pendulum swung in favor of the latter approach to organizing the relationship between church and state. These laws removed the Catholic Church from French schools, thus establishing a system of free, mandatory, and secular education. By requiring teachers to be laypersons and not priests, and establishing a secular curriculum in the classroom, these laws laid the foundation for French schools to become sites for educating citizens and for integrating them into a sense of national belonging that's free from religion. The 1905 law, or in 1905, the French government, under the leadership of prominent socialists, further entrenched the secular meaning of national belonging by introducing the law of separation between church and state. So the first article of this law, which guaranteed individuals' right to the free exercise of religion, inscribed laïcité as a principle that protects private religious beliefs and behaviors. The second article, which established the non-subsidization of religion by the church, expanded the reach of laïcité over public expressions of belonging by applying the institutional separation of church and state to the whole of the public sphere. So you now have a law in the books which protects individuals' religious beliefs, but also that guarantees the neutrality of the state when it comes to religious matters. So by 2003, politicians who were intent on restricting headscarves in schools in light of a growing Muslim population began calling forth an alternative approach to laïcité, one that aims to integrate newcomers by limiting their practice of religion to the private sphere. And the contours of that approach were drawn during the proceedings of the 2003 Stasi Commission, which was a state-appointed inquiry into the status of secularism in schools that heard testimony from teachers and activists and academics and politicians. And ultimately, the final report of the commission recommended a complete ban of ostentatious religious signs in all schools, among other things. In doing so, it departed from prior definitions of laïcité by suggesting that headscarves not only violate the secularity of the school as a public institution, but also that they potentially threaten the private religious rights of other students. So in this way, the Stasi Commission severed the link that had previously existed between providers of public services, who are required to physically embody the neutrality of the state, and users, whose conduct has until this period been defined according to the principle of freedom of conscience. The Stasi Commission also portrayed laïcité as an essential and constitutive element of French national identity. So according to the report, the French Republic has built itself around laïcité. All democratic states respect freedom of conscience and the principle of non-discrimination. However, France is unique in having declared laïcité a foundational value. It is the object of widespread consensus in our country. Each and every one of us proclaims it. A large majority of French legislators approved this discursive shift in the meaning of laïcité, voting in favor of a complete ban of ostentatious religious signs in schools in February 2004. By contrast, though, the vote to establish the 2010 face veil ban was much more divided. And that division, as you can see, I've highlighted in red, took the form of a very high number of abstentions, particularly within the Socialist Party, which has been the hegemonic party of the left since the late 1970s. Not only was it subject to a much higher level of political disengagement, the 2010 law was also unique in that it wasn't, like the 2004 law, justified on the basis of laïcité. In fact, afraid of deeming the face veil to be a religious sign, or politicians who were afraid that deeming the face veil to be a religious sign would amount to stigmatization of Muslims, opted to construct the law around the more neutral principle of public order, which was deemed to override the right to religious freedom. So laïcité was not the basis for the 2010 law, but rather public order. And the law itself states, garments that conceal the face threaten the public order, as it is defined by Article 10 of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. This article prescribes that no one shall be concerned for his opinions, even religious ones, provided their manifestation does not disturb the public order established by law. So covering one's face was deemed a threat to public order, even though laïcité was sort of behind the scenes as part of the discussion leading up to this law. So contrary then to the prevailing story, which attributes restrictive laws in France to widely shared Republican values like laïcité, the question of whether to ban facial coverings in public space was subject to a much higher level of political contestation than is commonly recognized. To understand the roots of that contestation and examine its effects on articulations of nationhood, I mobilized two kinds of data. To capture the official positions taken by the major parties as they vied for ownership of the religious signs issue, I draw on secondary historical materials as well as government and party documents. And I then combine this evidence with materials pertaining to politicians' role in the 2009 Gérin Commission, which was the government inquiry that preceded the 2010 face veil ban. As you can see, the French government does very little without having a commission to discuss it ahead of time. So this, between the months of June and December 2009, the commission's president, who was a communist MP named André Gérin, along with 31 other members of the French National Assembly, heard testimony from 78 individuals representing various social groups in France on the question of whether or not to legally ban facial coverings in public space. As in the subsequent parliamentary vote, members of the commission could not reach unanimous agreement about a law. Their report, however, strongly condemned the practice of veiling of the face on the basis that it violates the republican values of liberté, égalité, fraternité, and laïcité. So I conducted a qualitative analysis of the Commission's 200-page report, as well as its 400 pages of transcripts. While these sources provided insight into parties' public and official position-taking around the face veil, they revealed little about how individual politicians negotiated the dilemmas that arise from competition for ownership of this issue in the electoral sphere. So to capture those dilemmas and examine their implications for the production of nationhood, I drew on a subsample of the 29 semi-structured interviews I conducted with key actors in the face veil debate between 2012 and 2014. Specifically, I'm going to focus on the interviews I conducted with 9 members of the Gérin Commission board of various political stripes, including the Commission's president, the communist MP André Gérin. So in coding these interviews, I looked for evidence of frames and strategies that political actors mobilized when articulating their positions on the 2010 face veil ban. Recognizing that the two are intimately related, I distinguished frames as those claims that involved a packaging of ideas and thus a cognitive ordering that relates events to one another. So these are action-oriented sets of beliefs and meanings that inspire and legitimate the activities and campaigns of collective actors. And then I read as strategies statements in which political actors linked their interest to potential constituents by bridging, amplifying, extending, or transforming existing frames. So how have French political parties navigated the axis of competition in France? Well, the two main parties competing for the power and legitimacy to govern in France are the left-wing socialists and the right-wing Union pour un mouvement populaire, which renamed themselves Les Républicains in 2015. As the all-encompassing party of the left, the socialists have traditionally vied for electoral success on the basis of an economic vision that prioritizes diminishing class inequality. Thanks to its focus on this issue, the party has also traditionally fared much better in constituencies that feature a large number of immigrants, particularly from North African regions. Like left-wing parties elsewhere, the socialists have also taken up post-materialist values as part of their program, like from feminism to the environment. And this shift has complicated the party's relationship to the working class and to class ideology more generally. Although it still competes with parties like the Communist Party for working class votes, the Socialist Party has increasingly become one of white-collar, middle-class voters and membership. By contrast, as the predominant party of the right in France, the UMP has tied its economic vision to free market principles. As a result, it's attracted voters who are economically more conservative, especially shopkeepers, craftsmen, and farmers. But it has also, over the last several years, taken up the issue of national identity with increasing fervor, thus attracting more votes from practicing Catholics. Now, republicanism and its various ideals is part of the toolkits of both of these political parties, but it hasn't traditionally been the object of contestation between them. It's considered a constitutive element of French nationhood, but it's the kind of idea that permeates discourse without ever having to be defined. It's just there in the background. The rise of the Front National, the ultra-right Front National party, has disrupted this state of affairs. By centering its platform on the claim that immigrants are taking jobs away from native French citizens, thus threatening the social fabric of the nation, the party has added further confusion to the relationship of material and post-material values in the party political system in France. Although she shares the UMP's call for a free marketplace, the current party leader Marine Le Pen has also appropriated some of the populist themes previously owned by the left, such as the idea of le peuple, or the people. As a result, the party has polled increasingly well with working class voters, particularly those who inhabit France's older industrial and urbanized regions. The Front National has also challenged the existing axis of competition by transforming republicanism into a resource for political gains-making. So this strategy is evidenced, for example, in the party's use of images of the iconic female Republican figure Marianne in some of its posters, as if the party itself owns this image of Marianne as le premier parti de France. Given how committed the Front National has been to safeguarding France's Catholic heritage, this image speaks volumes about the pliability of republicanism as a discourse in French politics today. So by treading on the territories of the Socialists and UMP, the Front National has significantly destabilized the traditional left-right axis of competition in French politics. As I mentioned, the UMP renamed itself Les Républicains in 2015, which further transforms Republican ideals into partisan resources. Now the UMP is the Republic, essentially. The rise of the Front National has also encouraged its rivals to shore up their dedication to rooting out religious signs, such as the niqab and burqa, in the interest of gaining at least some ownership of these issues in political discourse. This cartoon illustrates very clearly the perception among French political pundits that in trying to deflect the threat of the Front National to their own political territories, the Socialists and UMP have taken overlapping stances on issues, including the face veil. But as I showed earlier, when it came to deciding whether to legally ban face veils in public space, the Socialists had a number of misgivings. Indeed, the vast majority of them abstained from even participating in the parliamentary vote. Some socialists opposed the law outright, believing that it would only serve to stigmatize French Muslims, which, as I mentioned, is one of the party's core constituencies. And others approved the broad effort to curtail face veils, but were reticent to appear supportive of a law that had been proposed by their main opponents, the UMP. Eager to maintain the outward appearance of party unity, the socialist leadership recommended that its members abstain from the parliamentary vote to pass the law. But as I'll show, that directive did not prevent members of this and other left-wing parties from being compelled by the competition for issue ownership to attach their own meanings to the 2010 face veil ban, and in the process to participate in the production of French nationhood. So through my private interviews with politicians, I gained insight into the ways that dilemmas arising from this battle for issue ownership inform party political claims regarding nationhood. And I found that two very different scenarios occurred on the right and left sides of the political spectrum. On the right side, I found evidence of relative consensus over the ways to situate the face veil in relation to French national belonging. That evidence came in the form of three interrelated frames. So some politicians whom I interviewed drew on this image of a clash between French Catholic culture and the Islamic religion, to condemn veiling as a highly dangerous practice. And I borrow from Huntington to call this the clash of civilizations frame. A second group used the face veil debate as an opportunity to dredge up concerns that immigrants, particularly North African immigrants, are a drain on the welfare state. So I call this the economic threat frame. And still others frame the face veil as threatening the universal values that demarcate French national particularity. And I call this the particular universalism frame. So in the next few slides, I'll show that although somewhat different, all three frames ultimately serve to bolster this claim that veiling signifies religious Muslims' incapacity to belong to the French nation. Now, on the left side of the aisle, a much more fundamental quandary and dilemma was taking place. Within the Socialist Party in particular, the pressure to appear as concerned by the threat of veiling as the UMP or the Front National produced deep cleavages that were manifested in two opposing discursive strategies. So the first strategy consisted of rejecting right-wing frames in favor of a more inclusive conception of national belonging. This strategy was mainly constituted by attempts to uncover the racist underpinnings of the 2010 law. The second strategy was to transform right-wing frames in order to demonstrate how the 2010 law coincides with left-wing values. So motivated primarily by this desire to own the face veil issue, this strategy produced new representations of the law as part of a left-wing political project. Ultimately, I'll show the latter strategy has prevailed until recently because there are some indications now that there may be a return to a more tolerant approach to religious signs within the Socialist Party. So let's start with the frames that were utilized by members of the UMP, which was the party in power at the time that the 2010 law was passed. So in justifying this law to the French public, members of the party relied heavily on what I'm calling the clash of civilizations frame, initially popularized by Nicolas Sarkozy during his 2007 bid for the French presidency. Hoping to capture the attention of Front National supporters, many of whom are Catholic, Sarkozy called forth a revised version of laïcité, which is anchored in France's Catholic heritage. He said, laïcité does not have the power to cut France from its Christian roots. To pull out the root is to erase the meaning of laïcité, to weaken the cement of national identity, to further weaken those social relationships that crucially depend on symbols and memory. This is why we must hold together the two ends of the chain, assume the Christian roots of France, even develop them, while defending laïcité, which has finally matured. So you can see here that secularism and Catholicism are being merged into a very sort of nuanced package in this quote. And so UMP politicians who are active in the debate around the face veil deployed this image of a clash of civilizations to vilify the niqab and burqa. For example, speaking generally of Islam's impact on French society, UMP member Jacques Millard told me, "We have allowed into our territory people who are inassimilable because Islam is not a religion, it's a civil code. If you assault the public sphere with religious elements, it will be civil war." So in further denouncing the face veil, UMP members also called forth a second frame common to the Front National's political platform, which is that immigrants, particularly those of North African origin, are a drain on the economy. In our interview, for example, the UMP member Georges Matron raised the issue of social assistance fraud in this community, claiming that the fraudsters are all of Arab origin. I see it every day and I fight against it. People who are Gaulois like me, that is to say people of French origin who do not live off social assistance, know that these people are getting free health care. So these kinds of complaints about social assistance fraud may be seen as deliberately linked to a desire to strengthen the boundary between native French citizens and domestic others, at least in the case of Muslim immigrants and their descendants. As in the statement by Millard, that boundary has both a cultural and a political meaning. So insofar as they transgress the cultural norms of belonging to the French nation, Muslims also hinder, by taking advantage of, the welfare state. In asserting the otherness that religious Islam allegedly represents, UMP members also deployed a third frame, which I'm calling the particular universalism frame. And this captures a set of claims in which the face veil is deemed to threaten the universal values, quote unquote, like women's dignity and equality, that set France apart from other nations. So speaking to the comparison between France and Britain, for example, Millard claimed in our interview, in France, women have always been equal to men. They accompanied men in combat in the Gaullist era, and Joan of Arc drove the barbarous English out of France. So this false notion that gender equality constitutes a historic feature of French national identity was also cited by other right-wing actors as evidencing a boundary between France and the Islamic powers of the Middle East. So in the words of Nicolas Hamelin, for example, we are not in Saudi Arabia, we are in France. France protects you, it liberates you. Therefore, I fully support the law. The burqa has no place in France where women are free. So Hamelin's statement strategically links the particularity of French culture to protection of universal values like gender equality. By particularizing the universal in this way, she's able to maintain her colleagues' emphasis on France's cultural uniqueness while also appealing to the universalizing claims of Western feminist organizations that oppose veiling on similar grounds. So ultimately, all three of the frames deployed by right-wing politicians bolstered this perception that Islamic practices like the face veil undermine the values that anchor the cultural and political terms of belonging to the French nation. But as I said, a much different and more complex scenario emerged on the left side of the political spectrum. That is that while some rejected the law outright on the basis of its racist underpinnings, other left-wing politicians were keen to salvage it by transforming its meaning in ways that align with traditionally left-wing political values. So beginning with the first strategy, there were many socialists who outright rejected the 2010 law. And in framing that rejection, they emphasized that the law reinforces a system of racial prejudice in France. So according to the socialist MP Sandrine Mazetier, the motivations of those in favor of legislating seemed instrumental. To be clear, the law merely provided them with an alibi for their racism and Islamo-paranoia. Other socialist politicians were similarly reticent to approve the law. For example, the socialist MP Danielle Hoffmann-Rispal showed deep concern during our interview over her colleagues' neglect of the face veil's relationship to underlying social inequalities in France. So she said, "I understand where this reactive identity in the Muslim community comes from. It comes from the Republic's failure to integrate and from the fact that politics no longer inspires people. During the last election campaign, I spoke with young people in my neighborhood. They told me we're on welfare. We no longer know where we're from. We're not considered French. Even with degrees, we can't find work." So by capitulating to the right's obsession with religious signs, Hoffmann-Rispal believes the French left has lost its capacity to generate public concern around themes that it previously owned, such as material suffering and inequality. A ban on face coverings, she argues, only exacerbates the marginalizing effects of prior governments' failure to meaningfully integrate immigrants into the Republican project. Given the strength of their objections, we might have expected Mazetier and Hoffmann-Rispal and others like them to vote against the 2010 law. But this option was restricted by the competition among parties to own the face veil issue. Rather than oppose the law, which many of its members found objectionable, the Socialist Party sought to maintain the appearance of unity by recommending abstention from the parliamentary vote. And that directive put pressure on people like Hoffmann-Rispal to hold back on their critique of the law. So she revealed in our interview, "I did not want to draw attention to myself, so I abstained. I told my group I intended to vote against, but they convinced me not to. It was really the only position we could all agree on." So having been discouraged from casting a ballot against the 2010 law in the parliamentary vote, left-wing actors that I interviewed set about transforming the meaning of the law in ways that coincide with a distinctly left-wing approach to French national belonging. And they started by denouncing the portrayals of laïcité that have been adopted by right-wing political actors. In particular, they tried to show that in adopting laïcité for political gain, the UMP have grossly misrepresented its meaning. This is the argument that the author Patrick Kessel takes up in his book, They Stole Laïcité. And like the historian Jean Bobéro, Kessel maintains that right-wing articulations of laïcité contain remnants of a counter-revolutionary and counter-republican ideology. This version of laïcité, which some call catho-laïcité, in light of its emphasis on Catholicism, as you saw in the Sarkozy quote, ultimately is seen as undermining the secularity of public space by glorifying France's Catholic symbols and history. So in order to re-articulate the meaning of the 2010 law to coincide with a more left-wing Republican narrative, politicians discursively tied the face veil ban to more generalized threats to the state and the public interest in France. So for example, in our interview, the communist head of the Gérin Commission bemoaned the fact that there are some territories in France in which there is Sharia in the public space. For us, he went on, the public space is the Republic. So by treating the Republic as synonymous with the public space in this quote, Gérin made clear his belief that French national belonging involves a particular kind of political engagement, one that excludes ways of organizing citizens' relationship to the state, such as Sharia, that contradict the Republican political ethos. So like his right-wing counterparts, Gérin regards the face veil as unsuited to French political culture. But unlike them, he attributes that unsuitability to the practice's alleged threat to the role of the state. Socialist MPs have echoed Gérin's concern that Islamic religious practices impede participation in the welfare state. For example, in describing laïcité as indistinguishable from the social struggle, Socialist MP Jean Glavany imagines laïcité as integral to the way France delivers services to its citizenry. Rather than simply defend laïcité when it's attacked, he suggested in our interview that we must promote it through training programs for teachers and in schools. It must be respected in hospitals. So what you see here is an attempt which is motivated by the contest for issue ownership to re-articulate the dangers of veiling in terms that are consistent with a left-wing legacy that involves safeguarding the public dimensions of belonging and participation in the French nation. What this strategy of transformation does not do, though, is it doesn't significantly challenge the perception that veiling is ultimately incompatible with republicanism. For example, if you look at the following statement by the former Prime Minister Manuel Valls, who was one of the few socialists to ignore his party's directive and vote in favor of the 2010 law, this perception of the conflict with republicanism is still very pervasive. So he says, the law that prohibits facial coverings in public space is an emancipatory law. It is a law that fosters women's liberation, a law that bolsters the equality of men and women, a law that enables us to combat all fundamentalisms. So yes, secularism is the law, and the republic is shared. But consider how this statement does or does not depart from comments made by Nicolas Sarkozy about the face veil ban in 2010. He says, we are an old nation assembled around a certain ideal of human dignity, particularly women's dignity, and around a certain ideal of life in a community. The veil that entirely conceals the face threatens these values, which are for us so fundamental, so essential to the Republican contract. So at first glance, these statements seem to overlap in their conception of the face veil's position with respect to French nationhood. But subtle differences appear when you look more closely. Whereas Sarkozy calls forth this image of an old nation which is rooted in a certain ideal of life in a community, Valls mobilizes a more inclusive conception of the nation, represented by the image of a shared republic. What's more, Valls underscores the importance of universal principles like emancipation, liberation, and equality. By contrast, Sarkozy utilizes more conservative themes, such as dignity and the importance of values, in order to demonstrate the inconsistency between the face veil and republicanism. But both of these guys ultimately favored a law prohibiting face veils in public space in the name of republicanism. So by interpreting republicanism as the driving force for these restrictive laws, we miss the crucial differences in the ways that it is articulated. Differences that I have argued bear the marks of inter- and intra-party political debates in France. So to summarize, I've attempted to show that rather than derive from widely shared Republican values, as this vast amount of literature on the French case suggests, France's 2010 law arose in significant part out of party political struggles for the power and legitimacy to govern. Specifically, I found that in seeking to prevent the ultra-right Front National from monopolizing the religious signs issue, France's major right and left parties instrumentally cast republicanism as requiring the exclusion of face veiling from public space. But because it was forged in conflict, the discourse of incorporation that was generated is highly fractured and unstable. It conceals an ongoing struggle both between and within political parties in France over the precise meanings of Republican nationhood. Within the UMP, the main trend has been toward a narrower conception of belonging in the French nation. Echoing the Front National's preoccupation with culture and nationality, which often manifests itself in claims that immigrants are a drain on the economy, members of this party have explicitly claimed that the face veil violates the cultural and political dimensions of French national belonging. By contrast, the contest for issue ownership has created a much more divisive environment on the left side of the political spectrum. While some openly reject the law on the basis of its racist underpinnings, other left-wing politicians are keen to salvage it by demonstrating its consistency with left-wing ideals, such as the centrality of the state in public life. The resulting conception of national belonging bears the marks of the recent struggle with the UMP. In other words, I'm arguing that you can't understand the socialist current position without knowing these prior battles that they've gone through. So on the one hand, the position taken by the Socialist Party matches the UMP's rejection of veiling, with many prominent politicians like Manuel Valls calling for curtailing this practice in the public sphere. But it also bears the marks of an underlying struggle to ensure that in affirming the right's attack on Islam, the left in France doesn't lose sight of its progressive heritage. These findings have implications for the way sociologists study the production of nationhood in debates over Islamic religious signs. Most generally, I think they underscore the dire need to bring politics, and particularly party politics, into such studies. Although ideas like republicanism matter insofar as they frame the discursive environment in which debates over this issue take place, we need to think more rigorously about how and why political actors manipulate these ideas for political gain, and how those manipulations ultimately impact ways of defining who belongs to the nation and how. The findings also point to the unique dilemmas that left-wing parties now face as a consequence of growing competition from the ultra-right, especially in Europe. So as I mentioned, most research that examines the consequences of ultra-right competition focuses on the threat posed to other right-wing parties. But as I've shown, the populist rhetoric that ultra-right political parties use, for example, when they claim to represent le peuple, or the common man, very much threaten or infringe on left parties' reputations as the defenders of the marginalized. So the ways that left parties resolve these dilemmas, I think, will significantly impact how Muslim and other minorities are represented in discourses of national identity, membership, and belonging in France and elsewhere. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for a fascinating discussion, and surprisingly, the French made it about themselves again. Is what, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Make fun of the whole situation, but
yep.
Of course you did it in a much more decisive way. And there will be an opportunity to take questions, and I'll let you handle them yourself.
Sure.
You have experience. Thank you.
Yeah. Any
questions? I actually have two questions, if it's okay.
Yeah.
So first, you mentioned that you're comparing this case with Quebec, and I wonder what are the conclusions from your comparison. And second, when you were theorizing the case, I wonder why did you decide to dub the right-wing strategies as frames and the left-wing ones as strategies?
Okay. So thank you for asking about the Quebec case, because some of the conclusions that I've drawn in studying the French faith veil debate actually arose from thinking about how this compares and contrasts with recent debates over religious signs in Quebec. So for those of you who may not know, Quebec is a large French-speaking province in Canada, which has, over the last several decades, its politics have centered around the question of its autonomy within Canada and the question of potentially becoming a sovereign nation. But that, as elsewhere, has increasingly implicated or involved this question of how immigrants participate in the public sphere in Quebec society, because there is a huge number of immigrants that enter Quebec every year, largely from former French colonies, so these are French-speaking immigrants. And so over the last decade or so, debates have emerged about how to integrate or incorporate this large Muslim population, and it's centered around the question of reasonable accommodation, which is, so to what extent should religious requests be granted in various public spaces and institutions. And in 2013, the sovereigntist Parti Québécois proposed a charter of values, which, among other things, recommended that public employees be disallowed from wearing any religious signs on the job. So you would not be able to wear, actually I have these are the signs that you would not be, the top row are the signs that you would have been allowed to wear had this law been passed. And then the other ones on the bottom row, the larger signs, which of course are largely non-Catholic or non-Christian, would be prohibited under this law. So ultimately, the Parti Québécois government was not able to pass this law because it called an election and surprisingly lost that election. And what I find interesting about the contrast between France and Quebec in terms of how to think about the role of politics and political parties in these debates is that I think that while in France, UMP and socialists, because their contention was so rooted in economic issues historically, they've been to some extent able to share ideas of republicanism. So republicanism has not been the basis of contention. So when it arises, when the Front National brings it up as sort of something that means that we should exclude immigrants, parties can kind of share in that idea. But in Quebec, politics is actually rooted in parties' different conceptions of the nation and what Quebec nationhood represents. So I think that it's more difficult for parties in Quebec to share questions about religious signs. And that's why there's been a lot more political polarization around the question, for example, of the Charter of Values in Quebec, where you have the Sovereigntist Party really calling for this exclusion of signs, but the Liberal Party, which is the equivalent of the Canadian Liberal Party, Justin Trudeau, I'm sure you've all heard of him, the equivalent at the provincial level is very much against these laws. So you have this incredible polarization, and I think because if you look at the roots or the structure of contention in the party political system, it's more difficult for parties that have based their identities in different notions of what the nation means to share ideas around these kinds of issues. So those are kind of the conclusions I'm sort of exploring in this comparison. But so in terms of why frames for the UMP versus strategies, so a lot of these ideas can be described as frames. I mean, laïcité itself could be a frame. Republicanism could be a frame. These are terms from the social movement literature that I like the notion of frames because it, as opposed to ideology, really emphasizes what different actors bring to the meaning of different social issues. So there's the idea of contestation is built into the notion of frames. I use the term strategies for the Socialist Party because I think that the Socialist Party is in a much more reactive position than the UMP is, for example. I don't think that the Socialist Party has been in a position to establish frames that orient the discourse in the way that the UMP has been able to. And so I use the term strategies because I think that denotes the more responsive, reactionary aspect of the Socialist Party's position in trying to take those existing frames and kind of manipulate them for its own benefit, or at least to survive in this debate around religious signs. So I think frames captures the fact that the UMP at least has the ability to set a certain tone, and the socialists are reacting by taking various strategic measures to sort of counteract that.
All of this took place before the Paris terrorist attacks.
Yes.
Was there any kind of terrorist context to this, or did this all just take place without any kind of context like that?
Yeah. I mean, there's a larger global backdrop to these debates. So I don't mean to suggest that they merely have to do with parties' interests. There's the whole issue of global terrorism and increasing politicization of Islam and its role around the world. And within the domestic North African Muslim community in France, there have been successive kind of riots and expressions of discontent, largely having to do with economic marginalization as well, and sort of the historic colonial relationship of that population to France has always been a very uncomfortable and deep-seated one, and one that hasn't been addressed in a straightforward way by any of the political parties. Like, I don't think you'll find that sort of post-colonial discourse, or anti-racism in general, that has been somewhat part of the discourse, but there hasn't been a real reckoning with the colonial history, and so there have been some somewhat violent confrontations between parts of the North African community and the majority society that do, I think, feed in symbolically to these questions. But no, this is prior to the more large, the recent events that you're talking about. Yeah. Yes.
So you said Trudeau and the Liberal Canadian Party took a stance against some of these laws. What is their analysis of the debate, and is it similar? Do they take a similar stance to those that abstained of voting in France?
Okay. Yeah, so it is a somewhat different context. So in the Canadian case, I'm talking about Quebec in particular, but the Liberal Party in Quebec, which was very much opposed to these proposals, is tied to the Canadian Liberal Party, which is the sort of inheritor of multiculturalism in Canada. So Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who brought in multiculturalism in the 1970s. So there's a very strongly established kind of multicultural, pluralist recognition of difference kind of discourse in Canadian politics, which also exists at the provincial level in Quebec. That is not, I don't think, that is not as well established in France. France does not have, even at the academic level, as I was saying, the sort of language for speaking about difference in the terms that recognize race, racism, and colonial history. So I think the Socialist Party is very much, in the interviews that I did with some socialists, you'll see those issues being raised, but there isn't the same kind of established language for talking about racism and how it's manifested in French society. That role, that kind of way of talking is really being left to the sort of civil society organizations in France. So feminist groups that are arising that are against these restrictive laws, although they have a much more marginalized voice in French politics, they are being left to articulate that more radical anti-racist critique of these laws because there isn't that space within the Socialist Party. And I think partly what I'm trying to show is that that space is lacking because of the sort of strategic limitations that the Socialist Party faces by virtue of the way these issues are debated in French in electoral politics. Yes.
I wonder if you could speak, if you feel comfortable speaking about the production of nationhood or republicanism in France around other debates that may have to do with immigrants or others. I mean, what I'm struck by is, of course, the face veil is very much around females, right? Mm-hmm. But I'm wondering if there are other debates that articulate and kind of and overlap and inform the larger heated debate. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
That's a really good question. I mean, I would say, but it's another debate that involves gender. It's that the discussion of Republican nationhood in the last several decades has been very much centered on questions of gender. So this is now emerging, you know, veiling and religion is emerging as an issue that intersects with these questions of gender very clearly. But the role of feminists in articulating what French Republican nationhood means has been kind of at the forefront of politics for the last several decades, not necessarily in the mainstream political discourse, but I think the Republican language has been used to kind of figure out what constitutes gender equality, where men and women fit into the society. And I think the fact that those debates haven't really been resolved, that you still have as much as you have disagreement over the meaning of laïcité and debates over religious science, you have an incredible sort of muddied debate over what the meaning of gender is in a French Republican context. You'll have feminists in France who see gender equality as meaning that there is no distinction at all between men and women, and others who see the recognition of difference as crucial to women's rights and equality. So I think that gender has always been a key theme, at least in the sort of 1970s onward, in thinking about what French republicanism means. And the insertion of this question of Islam and religious science into that debate kind of complicates the whole question of gender and brings it back to the forefront, even though you have a very sort of male-dominated politics in France. So this is happening in the background and being discussed by a sort of elite male political class, but those issues have always been very, very much de rigueur in those conversations. Yes.
Well, I'm very struck by the fact that you said that there were 1,200 women who used face veils.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, 1,200, and what's the population of France? Is like what, how many
60
million?
million.
60 million.
And you have about 5 million Muslim.
5 million.
people.
I mean, 1,200 is like 0.00 what, 1%? I mean, we're talking about a very negligible proportion. The fact that, it's numerically so small but can map onto such a significant cultural issue in itself is like, trying to, pass a law here in Ann Arbor about a mosquito that is like in South America or something. I mean,
Right.
it's quite irrelevant to what's going on in society if you think about it in its impact. So would you like to comment on that
Yeah.
inequity there?
Sure. Yeah, I think that it seems remarkable that such a minor practice in terms of the number of people would become so politicized and so much the basis of national political debate. But on the other hand, I don't think it's that surprising when you think about it. I mean, the question of this opposition to veiling and this desire to unveil the Muslim woman is already so entrenched in Western feminist writing. And it is sort of seen as symbolizing the embodiment of women's opposition. And it's subject to a very fervent campaign to sort of unveil the Muslim women. So in terms of Western feminist discourse, the idea of trying to, bring the Muslim woman into a more universal notion of femininity, that is already established. And I think it's also easy to target marginalized populations like Muslims who are economically much less well off, who are segregated into these sort of marginalized neighborhoods. And indeed, actually, one of the organizers of the Gérin Commission, who I interviewed as sort of like a civil servant behind the scenes guy, I asked him, why is it so easy to pass a law like this? And he says, well, these women aren't going to demonstrate in the streets. This is a population that you don't have to worry that much about the potential uprising and sort of backlash. This is a group of people that is already fairly silent. By making it so that they can't wear these signs in the streets, you're all but guaranteeing that they're going to stay home. So it's a group of people that you can easily galvanize public opinion around, but that is relatively unable to have to really react in any strong way. And I also think the visibility of these religious signs makes them very symbolically weighty in the public consciousness. So it's easier to target something that you can see than other kinds of practices or issues that are.
I would argue that there's also another dimension that may have to do with the colonial French past, of course.
Absolutely.
I mean, before feminism, unveiling women, of course, colonialism in France, or at least France's exploitation of the rest of the world was totally legitimated by unveiling the women.
Absolutely.
They went in to liberate the women, presumably, and of course ended up hegemonizing and dominating the society. So that also is a very bizarre way of how French prejudices and discriminatory practices continue.
Absolutely, absolutely, and are carried forward by very prominent feminist organizations who I didn't talk about in this talk because I was focusing on political parties, but I've also done interviews with feminist organizations in France, both who are in favor of these laws and who are against. And the feminists who support these laws have never been more popular. I mean, their reasons for opposing veiling have really been incorporated and co-opted by political parties and politicians, kind of reinforcing that colonial domination that you were talking about that still very much exists within the feminist community in France as well. That kind of dichotomization between the Western feminist ideal and the unrecognized women in the Muslim community who have a very different language for talking about why they wear the headscarf, niqab, or burqa.
And that may be a difference with Quebec too, because I mean, of course, the Canadians are much more critically self-reflexive about their own past. I mean, like the First Nations and everything. Than
Yes.
French are, right?
Yeah, that's very true. But on the other hand, in Quebec, there's a weird relationship to colonialism because the Québécois are colonizers, but they are also colonized. And they see themselves as, you know, they use a colonial, an anti-colonial discourse to describe their relationship to English Canada. So that really muddies the whole question of how colonialism works. But there is a much more established kind of post-colonial feminism in Quebec, certainly, than there is in France. Yeah.
So, so I'm thinking about French colonialism and another commenter's questions about other cleavages that might exist in society around the question of who is French and what is nationhood. And so I'm wondering about whether, I don't expect you to have a fully theorized answer to this, but if in your research on this particular subsection of French culture, which is to say Muslim women or Muslims in general, if you came across any discrimination or similar ideas around other people who are from countries formerly colonized by France in sub-Saharan Africa or the Caribbean, as well as if the same mechanisms for marginalization exist for, say, Tunisian Christians and Jews, as well as Muslims, just try and tease out exactly how much of this is racist and how much of this is anti-Muslim.
Yeah, that's a tough question for me to answer based on the research that I've done, but I've been involved in some other comparative work where we use quantitative data to kind of look at these questions because of, you're right about these large other populations in France that are from the Dom regions that are not necessarily Muslim, and what you find is there's a heck of a lot of racism against other groups, particularly from Caribbean areas who you know, are encountering the same kinds of discrimination in the workplace and in the labor market. And it's hard to tease out how much of the Muslim effect has to do with race versus religion. But I think that there's no doubt that these underlying racial issues have a lot to do with pushing this idea of the secular public space really into the forefront. And you can see how much race has to do with that when you look at the Front National's kind of warped way of understanding what secularism means, because it becomes a secularism for white Catholics in France, right? And that's very clear. There's not even, I mean, there's more attempt to kind of hide that in the contemporary Front National discourse ever since, you know, the rupture between Marine Le Pen and her father, who is more of an overt kind of Holocaust-denying fellow, racist fellow. She has tried to sort of sanitize the Front National's language and discourse around all of these issues, but you can still very much see the intertwining of race and religion and gender. And as I'm trying to show, class issues are, if not causing these debates, the way that that class is discussed in politics, by whom and how, I think matters in interesting ways to how this question is talked about by politicians. But yeah, it's a tough question.
I think partly what I was also thinking about, what about its Jews, France's Jews, right? And that isn't so neatly about race or colony, right? Or it is about religion, but not in the same way that it is around Islam. So I have a question, and it may seem kind of odd, but I don't intend it as such. Who are these women? Like, 1,200 women isn't a lot of practicing Muslims. So I'm wondering, I mean, maybe the answer is obvious, perhaps not. Why so few? Who are they? Do you have an idea? I mean, I'm kind of curious about, I can imagine that some of them kind of want to resist this very racist, very elitist notion of the Republic and don the face veil. I understand that. And by my question doesn't mean to imply they shouldn't do what they do, but I'm just kind of trying to invite a conversation around what's going on there, who are they, why aren't there so many more, et cetera, et cetera.
Good question. Well, first I'll start by saying that the Gérin Commission that I studied, which invited these 78 people to talk about what they thought, and these were academics, legal experts, feminist organizations, journalists, lots of different kinds of people. Out of those 78 people, one person was a woman who wears a niqab. So they did invite one person. She was the very last person to be interviewed by the commission, and her testimony is the only one that you cannot access. So we have no way of knowing what this person said. So you can go online and you can read every other opinion rendered on the subject during the Gérin Commission, but you cannot know what this one woman who was brought up to the National Assembly building where they were having the interviews, and she had to, they pull up in a car and she has to take off the whole thing before entering a government building. So they did all that. So this was all described to me. But when I asked, well, what did she say? And I'm asking people like André Gérin, who's the head of the commission, who's very much in favor of this restrictive approach. He says, well, she said exactly what we thought she was going to say. She said that she chose to wear this, but we really know that blah blah. So you can't actually find out very much about what, at least from a sort of official, formal government politics perspective, what these women are. Why they're choosing to and to not wear these signs. So there have been some studies that interview. There's like a study of like 33 women, because it's such a small number. That's actually kind of like a fairly large sample, and they talk about the various a lot of them are converts actually to Islam. A lot of them are not born in a Muslim family. A lot of them have families and parents who disapprove of them wearing these signs, and they're doing it anyway. And I conducted some interviews with feminists in the Muslim community who don't wear the niqab and burqa, but who wear headscarves and who are very much mobilizing around this issue. And they're uncomfortable with the full veil themselves. They wouldn't choose to cover themselves to that extent, but they're still very much in line with the idea that this is a personal choice deriving from women's personal relationship to religion. And that and very adamant on saying this doesn't have to do with anyone imposing these signs necessarily, that there is a personal choice that's made. So I think there are many different reasons to do so, but I think what's interesting is how little we can know about that by looking at public debates around this issue. And I think that's a testament to how closed the political system is, and even the media in France, which is not particularly representative of all of these different groups. So you really have to go, and that's kind of where I'm continuing my work, is with the Quebec case as a comparison, interviewing feminist groups on opposing sides of this issue. And I'm finding that there's a really deep contention between different feminist groups that operates in different ways in the two contexts. But so far from my interviews, I've found that these women feel incredibly excluded by other feminists and by the whole feminist movement in France. So there's a difficulty in finding a way to communicate in response to all of these big ideas around republicanism and what that means. Yeah.
Well, thank you
Thank
very
you.
much for a wonderful discussion.
Thank you very much.